The wind carried the scent of salt and damp earth through the small coastal town, a place where the sea was both cradle and thief. Elias and Mara had made their home here 12 years ago, in a cottage perched precariously on a cliff's edge, its whitewashed walls weathered by time and tide. To the outside world, they were a steady pair, Elias, the lighthouse keeper with hands roughened by rope and oil, and Mara, the painter whose canvases captured the wild dance of waves against rock. Their life seemed simple, woven into the rhythm of the town's quiet days. But beneath the surface, something had begun to shift, faint as a whisper in the fog. Elias was a man of habit. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he trudged up the winding path to the lighthouse, his heavy boots crunching against gravel. The tower stood tall and solitary, its beam a lifeline for ships navigating the treacherous coast. He'd climb the spiraling iron stairs, check the oil, polish the lens, and set the light to spinning, a ritual as steady as his own heartbeat. By the time he returned home, the stars would be out, and Mara would be waiting with a pot of tea or a sketchbook in hand. It was a dance they'd perfected over the years. Lately, though, the steps felt heavier. Not from age. Elias was only 42, but from a weight he couldn't name. Mara had changed, or perhaps he had. She still smiled at him across the breakfast table, her dark hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. But her eyes seemed to linger elsewhere, as if caught by a horizon he couldn't see. She'd stopped asking him about the ships he spotted from the tower, stopped teasing him about the oil stains on his sleeves. Instead, she spoke of the sea in abstract terms, its moods, its colors, her voice trailing off into thoughts she didn't share. One crisp October morning, Elias found the first thread of something amiss. He was in the kitchen, pouring coffee from the dented tin pot, when his gaze fell on a book Mara had left on the table. It was an old volume of poetry, its leather cover cracked and faded. She often read such things, her painter's mind drawn to the rhythm of words. So he thought little of it, until a slip of paper fluttered from its pages as he brushed it aside. He bent to retrieve it, his fingers closing around a note folded once, then unfolded, as if it had been read and reread. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sloping and elegant where Mara's was quick and jagged. "Meet me where the tide kisses the shore," it said, the ink slightly smudged, as if pressed by a nervous thumb. Below the words was a single initial, a looping, confident C. Elias stood there, the coffee cooling in his hand, the note a sudden weight against his palm. His first instinct was to call out to Mara, who was upstairs humming faintly as she dressed, but something stopped him. A flicker of unease, sharp and cold. He slipped the note into his pocket instead, the paper rustling against the rough wool of his coat. All day, as he repaired a frayed rope at the lighthouse and watched gulls wheel against a gray sky, the words looped through his mind. Where the tide kisses the shore. The phrase was poetic, deliberate, like something Mara might paint. But the sea gnawed at him. He knew no one in town by that initial, not among the fishermen or shopkeepers who nodded to him in passing. Was it a friend, a stranger, or something else entirely? That evening when he returned home, Mara was at the stove, stirring a pot of chowder. The kitchen smelled of clams and thyme, warm and familiar. She glanced over her shoulder, her smile soft but fleeting. "Long day?" she asked, her voice light. "Same as always," Elias replied, hanging his coat by the door. The note burned in his pocket, but he kept his tone even. "You," she shrugged, turning back to the stove. "Painted a little, walked a little, the usual." Her words were casual, but there was a pause before the usual, a breath too long. Elias watched her, the way her shoulders tensed slightly, the way her fingers tightened around the wooden spoon. He wanted to ask about the book, the note, the sea, but he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he sat at the table, the poetry book still there, its pages splayed open as if inviting him to look again. He didn't touch it. Mara set a bowl of chowder in front of him, her hand brushing his briefly as she pulled away. The touch was warm, but it felt like a memory, like something already slipping through his fingers. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. The sea churned below the cliff, its voice a restless murmur. Elias ate in silence, the note a secret he carried alone, a crack in the foundation of their quiet life. He didn't know what it meant. Not yet. but he felt the tide turning, slow and inevitable, pulling them towards something he couldn't yet see. The days grew shorter as October bled into November, the sun sinking earlier behind the jagged line of the horizon. Elias kept the note in his coat pocket, a silent companion he touched now and then, its edges softening from the brush of his fingers. He hadn't mentioned it to Mara, hadn't asked about the book or the mysterious sea. Instead, he watched her, his hazel eyes tracing the small shifts in her routines, the subtle cracks widening in their shared life. Mara's walks became more frequent. She'd leave the cottage in the late afternoons, a scarf wound loosely around her neck, her boots leaving faint prints in the damp earth of the cliff path. "The light's best then," she'd say if Elias asked, her voice airy, her gaze sliding past him to the window. "It makes the waves glow." He'd nod, accepting the excuse, though he'd noticed her easel hadn't moved from its corner in weeks. The half-finished painting on it, a swirl of blues and grays, a storm taking shape, gathered dust, its edges curling inward like a forgotten promise. One evening, as Elias returned from the lighthouse, the beam already slicing through the gathering dusk, he caught sight of Mara coming up the path from the beach. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair tangled by the wind, and her scarf hung loose, trailing behind her like a ribbon. She carried no sketchbook, no bag, just herself, her hands tucked into her pockets. She smiled when she saw him, but it was quick, almost reflexive, and her eyes darted to the side before meeting his. "Cold out there," Elias said, pausing on the path, his breath clouding in the chill air. "It is," she replied, stepping closer. "But the sea was alive tonight. You should have seen it." Her voice had that brightness again, the kind that lit her face in a way he hadn't seen in months, or maybe years. He nodded, saying nothing, but as she brushed past him toward the cottage, he caught a faint scent on her scarf. Not just salt and wind, but something warmer, like cedar or smoke. It lingered in the air, unfamiliar, and his stomach tightened. That night, over a supper of bread and stew, Elias studied her across the table. The lamplight cast soft shadows on her face, highlighting the fine lines around her eyes, the curve of her mouth as she ate. She seemed at ease, humming faintly under her breath, a tune he didn't recognize. He wanted to ask where she'd been, who she'd seen, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he said, "You haven't painted much lately." Mara's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down, her fingers brushing the edge of the bowl. "I suppose I haven't," she said, her tone thoughtful. "The sea's been enough on its own. I don't always need to capture it." She looked at him then, her gray eyes steady, and for a moment he thought she might say more. But she didn't. She rose to clear the dishes, her movements brisk, and the moment slipped away. Later, as Elias climbed the lighthouse stairs, the note crinkled in his pocket, a quiet accusation. He stood at the top, gazing out at the dark expanse of water, the waves glinting faintly under the beam, where the tide kisses the shore. The beach below the cliff wasn't far, a narrow strip of sand and stone, framed by dunes and the restless sea. He'd walked it with Mara countless times, her hand in his, their laughter mingling with the gulls' cries. Now the thought of her there with someone else, a faceless sea, twisted in his chest like a splinter. The next morning, Elias lingered in the cottage after Mara left for one of her walks. The air was still, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. He moved to her studio, a small room off the kitchen where her canvases leaned against the walls like silent sentinels. He hadn't been in here in months. Mara liked her space, and he'd respected that. Now though, curiosity pulled him forward. The room smelled of turpentine and old wood. Her brushes lay scattered on a table, their bristles stiff with dried paint. The half-finished storm painting sat on the easel, unchanged. But something else caught his eye, a small stack of papers tucked beneath a jar of linseed oil. He hesitated, then lifted the jar. The papers were sketches, quick and rough, a curve of dune grass, a wave breaking against rock, a shadow stretching long across the sand. And then in the corner of one, a single initial, C, scrawled in pencil, faint but unmistakable. Elias's breath caught. He turned the sketch over, but there was nothing else, no name, no date. Just that looping letter, a thread tying the note in his pocket to this hidden corner of Mara's world. He stood there, the paper trembling slightly in his hand, as the clock ticked on in the silence. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window pane, and he knew she'd be back soon. He replaced the papers, the jar, and left the room as he'd found it. But as he stepped outside to head for the lighthouse, the cedar smoke scent from her scarf lingered in his mind, and the shadow on her sketch stretched longer in his imagination. Whoever C was, they were no longer just a name on a note. They were a presence, creeping closer, and Elias felt the ground beneath him shift, slow and unsteady. November's grip tightened on the coastal town, the air growing sharp with frost, and the sea's voice turning restless. Elias carried the note in his pocket still, its words etched into his mind like a tide-worn groove. Meet me where the tide kisses the shore. The sea from Mara's sketch haunted him too, a silent echo linking the paper he held to the life she led beyond his sight. He hadn't confronted her. His nature wasn't one for storms, but his quiet had shifted into something watchful, a stillness that masked the churn beneath. Mara's walks grew longer, her returns less predictable. She'd come through the cottage door with the damp of the sea clinging to her coat, her cheeks flushed, her voice bright with vague tales of the cliffs or the dunes. Elias listened, nodding as he always had, but his eyes lingered on her now, on the way her fingers twisted the ends of her scarf, on the faint tremor in her smile when he asked where she'd been. Just wandering, she'd say, and he'd let it lie, though the cedar smoke scent followed her more often, faint but persistent. One afternoon, as a storm brewed offshore, Elias decided to follow her. The sky hung low, bruised with clouds, and the wind whipped at his coat as he watched her leave the cottage. She moved with purpose, her steps quick along the cliff path, her scarf fluttering like a signal. He waited until she disappeared around a bend, then trailed her, keeping to the shadows of the gorse bushes that lined the way. His boots sank into the soft earth, silent against the roar of the waves below. The path dipped toward the beach, a narrow crescent of sand cradled by dunes and sea-worn rocks. Elias paused at the edge of the cliff, peering down. There she was, Mara, standing where the tide lapped at the shore, her figure small against the vastness of the water. And she wasn't alone. A man stood with her, his back to Elias, his dark hair tousled by the wind. He was taller than Elias, his posture loose and easy, as if the beach were his domain. Mara faced him, her head tilted slightly, her hands gesturing in a way Elias recognized from their early days, alive, unguarded. He couldn't hear their words, the wind and waves swallowing them, but he saw the space between them shrink, then widen, then shrink again, a dance of nearness and retreat. Mara laughed once, the sound faint but unmistakable, and the man reached out, his hand hovering near her arm before dropping back to his side. Elias's chest tightened, a slow burn spreading through him, but he stayed rooted, the cold seeping into his bones. The encounter lasted only minutes. The man turned to leave, vanishing into the dunes, and Mara lingered, staring out at the sea as if it held answers. Elias retreated before she could spot him, his mind racing as he climbed back to the lighthouse. Who was he? The sea from the note, surely, but a name, a face, a history remained elusive. A stranger? A friend from before their life here? The questions gnawed at him, but he kept them locked behind his steady gaze. That night, Elias lit the lighthouse beam as always, its arc cutting through the gathering dark. But his thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in the image of Mara and the man on the beach. He needed more, not just suspicion but proof. And so, as the storm rumbled closer, he devised a plan, subtle as the tide's pull. The next morning, with Mara still asleep, Elias slipped into her studio again. The sketches were still there, beneath the jar of linseed oil, but he dug deeper this time, his hands careful but determined. Beneath the stack, he found a scrap of paper, not a sketch, but a note, crumpled and smoothed out again. Tomorrow at dusk, it read, the same elegant script as the first, signed with that looping C. His pulse quickened. Tomorrow, he could wait that long. That evening, Elias left his own note on the kitchen table, penned in a careful imitation of the script he'd seen. Meet me where the tide kisses the shore, he wrote, adding the C, with a flourish that felt foreign under his hand. He placed it where Mara would find it, then climbed to the lighthouse as usual, his heart a steady drumbeat. From the tower, he watched her through the window below. She paused at the table, her fingers brushing the paper, her brow furrowing before smoothing into something like anticipation. She tucked the note into her pocket and glanced toward the sea. As dusk fell the next day, Elias didn't go to the lighthouse. Instead, he took a lantern from the shed, its glass streaked with age, and made his way to the beach. The storm had passed, leaving the air heavy and still, the waves a low murmur. He hid among the dunes, the lantern unlit at his side, and waited. The tide crept in, kissing the shore just as the note promised, and soon Mara appeared, her silhouette stark against the fading light. She stood there, alone at first, scanning the horizon. Then the man emerged from the shadows, the same dark hair, the same easy stride. Elias's grip tightened on the lantern as they drew closer, their voices a soft hum against the sea. He couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. The way Mara leaned toward him, the way the man's hand brushed her scarf, it was enough. Elias lit the lantern, the glow spilling across the sand, and stepped out from the dunes. Mara's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide, and the man froze, caught in the light's unflinching stare. For a moment, no one spoke, the sea's breath the only sound. Then Elias's voice cut through low and steady. "I thought I'd see for myself," he said, the lantern casting long shadows behind him. The lantern's glow flickered across the beach, painting Mara and the man in hues of gold and shadow. The seaside behind them, its waves curling gently against the sand, oblivious to the fracture unfolding where the tide kissed the shore. Elias stood steady, his face calm but unreadable, the light in his hand a beacon of his own making. Mara's breath caught, her scarf slipping from her shoulder to trail in the damp sand, while the man, dark-haired, caught mid-step, shifted uneasily, his confidence unraveling under Elias's gaze. "Elias," Mara said, her voice trembling but soft, like a wave retreating. She took a step toward him, then stopped, her hands lifting as if to explain, then falling back to her sides. "It's not." "Don't," Elias interrupted, his tone even, almost gentle. "I don't need to hear it." His eyes flicked to the man, see Shirley, whose name still hung unspoken between them. The stranger's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his silhouette shrinking against the dunes as if he might fade into them. Mara's lips parted then closed. She looked at Elias, searching his face, but he gave her nothing. No anger, no tears, just a stillness that felt vast as the ocean at his back. The lantern swayed slightly in his grip, its light catching the salt on her cheeks, the faint tremble in her fingers. "How did you know?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found your note," Elias said simply, "and I wrote one of my own." He nodded toward the pocket where she'd tucked his forgery, the trap she'd walked into without a second thought. Her eyes widened, a flicker of understanding passing through them, followed by something heavier, regret perhaps, or fear. The man, Caleb, as Elias would later learn from a fisherman's loose tongue, cleared his throat, stepping forward as if to reclaim the moment. "Look, this doesn't have to," he began, but Elias raised a hand, silencing him without a glance. "This isn't about you," Elias said, his words clipped final. Caleb hesitated, then stepped back, his boots crunching on the sand as he retreated toward the dunes. He cast one last look at Mara, pleading maybe or resigned, before the shadows swallowed him whole. Mara didn't watch him go. Her gaze stayed on Elias, her breath uneven, the space between them stretching wide and cold. "What now?" she asked, her voice small against the sea's murmur. Elias didn't answer right away. He turned the lantern's knob, dimming its light until it was barely aglow, then set it down on the sand. The beach darkened, the stars above sharpening into view. "I don't know," he said at last, his eyes lifting to the cliff where the lighthouse stood, its beams still unlit tonight. "But I'm tired, Mara. Tired of pretending I don't see." He walked past her then, his shoulder brushing hers for the briefest moment, a touch that carried the weight of 12 years, now unraveling. She didn't follow, didn't call after him. She stood there, alone with the tide, as Elias climbed the path back to the cottage, then beyond it to the lighthouse. That night, he didn't light the beam. For the first time in his tenure as keeper, the tower stood dark, its silence a void against the restless sea. He sat at the top, the cold iron of the railing pressing into his palms, and watched the horizon. Below, a small fishing vessel, a speck of life in the vast black, drifted too close to the rocks. The crash came hours later, a distant splintering swallowed by the wind. Elias didn't flinch. By morning, the town buzzed with shock. A boat lost, 2 men drowned, the lighthouse blamed. The fishermen gathered at the docks, their voices rough with grief and questions. But Elias emerged from the tower, as if nothing had changed. He lit the beam at dawn, polished the lens, and met their stares with a shrug. "The sea takes what it wants," he said, his voice flat. And they couldn't argue with that. Mara was waiting when he returned to the cottage, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She'd heard the news. Everyone had. And the weight of it hung between them like a storm cloud. "Did you mean for that to happen?" she asked, her hands twisting in her lap. Elias paused in the doorway, his coat still damp from the morning mist. "I didn't mean for anything," he said. "I just stopped holding it back." He didn't look at her as he spoke, his gaze drifting to the window to the sea beyond. It wasn't a confession, not quite. Just a truth laid bare, as quiet and devastating as the tide. They didn't leave each other, not in the way people might expect. They stayed in the cottage, sharing the same roof, the same silences. Elias climbed the lighthouse stairs each night, keeping the beam steady now, while Mara returned to her paints, her canvases filling with storms darker than before. The townsfolk never suspected the rift, saw only the keeper and his wife, weathering life as they always had. But something had shifted, irrevocable and deep. Caleb never returned, his name a whisper that faded with the seasons. And Elias, in his quiet way, had let the sea speak for him, not with rage, but with a stillness that cut deeper than any words. The light went out once, and once was enough.